There's an underlying aspect of Before Sunrise that, despite its prominence in the words of its characters, seldom seems to be discussed. The film is certainly about love. I mean, after all, the romance shared between Jesse and Celine is the central focus of the entire trilogy. But interestingly, there's also plenty of talk about another opposite subject: death. And while that might sound doomy and gloomy, I promise to you this isn't some sort of beforesunrise.exe, they were dead the whole time, creepypasta analysis video. See, director Richard Linklater paralleled these two opposing themes of love and death for a specific purpose. While there's plenty of talk about death, it's actually a heartfelt celebration of life. So friends, in the happiest way possible, let's talk about dying.
Later.
Oh, shit. Oh yeah, my name's Jack, and welcome to Before Sunrise is one of the most dense pieces of art I've ever seen. I've watched and rewatched it countless times, and it seems that on each occasion I do, there's something new to be gleaned. Unfortunately, I don't really have the time to make a massive in-depth video exploring every nook and cranny of this film, which you could potentially fix by liking and subscribing. But for now, we'll focus on one aspect of it: death. For a romance movie, the subject of death gets brought up pretty often. One of Jesse and Celine's first conversations on the train is regarding death. Jesse recalls a story from his youth of seeing his recently deceased grandmother in the midst of a water hose. And Celine explains that she's only on a train in the first place because she's scared of dying in a plane crash.
So I'm in a train right now. I could have flown to Paris, but I'm too scared.
Jesse talks of reincarnation, the couple visits a graveyard and a church, and later Jesse also recounts how at the birth of his friend's son, all the father could think of was the fact that his child would die someday. Of course, all this talk of death is interspersed amongst other dialogue and character development devoted to the blossoming of their relationship through both their shared and contradicting beliefs about the world. So, what's the point in mentioning death so often in a story about love? I'm sure you've heard at some point that love and hate are actually quite related emotions, and in a sense, I believe this is the same sort of parallelism that's being evoked. As this is a story of two youthful people with relatively immature views of the world experiencing an equally youthful love, speaking so much of death creates a strong contrast and highlights the qualities of each end of the spectrum. Consider the mood implications. Young love is this very warm and soft sort of sensation, whereas death is cold and rigid. The theme participates in the overall tone that grips you so tightly as you watch. My favorite description of the emotions Before Sunrise creates comes from my friend who I watched it for the first time with, that there was never an action or thriller movie he's seen that's managed to keep him on the edge of his seat for what would happen next as much as this romance movie. While the overall subject of death permeates the story, it's more interestingly viewed through the different lenses offered to us by our deuteragonists. Both characters possess certain contradictory character traits, and express opinions that might be the opposite of what you'd initially expect them to have. For example, Jesse's a cynic that approaches everything from a more realistic point of view, yet characterizes himself as an immature boy that doesn't know how to grow up.
I always think that I'm still this 13-year-old boy, just live my life, taking notes for when I'll, really have to do it.
Mirroring this is Celine. She possesses a deal of emotional maturity and feels as though she's already an old woman. However, she's absolutely the more idealistic of the two, a trait commonly regarded as belonging to the young and naive. The two's differing perspectives on death is informed by these characterizations. Jesse is almost unbothered by the idea of dying and feels like some sort of an afterlife is ensured because of the experience he had when he was younger. He's got a classic young rebel attitude, shunning what others want or think for him in favor of doing the opposite. Because of this, he rejects his parents' explanation about his grandmother being gone forever and soldiers on, believing his own reality. But this confidence also stems from his naivety. Think back to when you were a child. How often were you really thinking about death? For many, especially before you really process it as a concept at all, it's the furthest thing from your mind because you're still so young. Death is reserved for the old adults, and Jesse doesn't really consider himself one yet. If he's just taking notes for when the real thing happens, then there's no real need to worry, because to him that real thing is still so far away. Of course, Celine would then have the opposite feeling. If she feels that she is this old woman, then death is inevitably going to be on her mind. And it is, to a frustrating degree.
I think I'm afraid of death 24 hours a day. I can't stop thinking that way. It's exhausting.
Part of this likely comes from her being introduced to death at a young age, and seeing the grave of the 13-year-old girl when she herself was 13. Celine has a sort of romantic notion about the fact that if no one knows you're dead, in some sense you're still alive.
If none of your family or friends knew you were dead, then it's like not really being dead.
And this is another illustration of the dichotomy between the two. Jesse is so set on doing the opposite of what everyone else tells him that this is something that would never occur to him, because his worldview is so centered around his own perception, instead of taking others into account. Jesse's mindset lingers between the lines of his rumination on reincarnation.
10,000 years ago, there's like 2 million people on the planet. Now there's between 5 and 6 billion people on the planet, right? We all have our own like individual, unique soul. You know, are modern souls only a fraction of the original souls?
His perspective makes perfect sense in the context of his emotional state. If he feels incomplete, like he hasn't grown up yet and is still unable to, then of course his soul is only going to feel like a fraction of a complete soul. It's these tiny details that I really appreciate about the film and that make it such a joy to experience over and over. Alongside death, there's talk of its companion, birth. The pair walk by a woman performing a dance, and this makes Celine remember hearing about a dance that women in a tribe do in order to facilitate the birth of their child. The most significant moment of juxtaposing these two aspects is when Jesse tells Celine about his friend when they're on the boat.
He said at that profound moment of birth, all he could think about was that he was looking at something that was gonna die someday.
Interestingly, this story is in many ways Celine's point of view about her own life, that instead of being in the moment to recognize and live in it, she's plagued with the thought of it ending in death. Yet, that's what makes what she says next so important.
I'm not so scared of flying. I mean, I could.
Harkening back to the beginning of the movie, the love between the two has developed so much in this short time frame that she's willing to overcome her fear of death for the sake of love. And so this brings me to the fact that... What? A movie? With a metaphor? You gotta be kidding me. The time that Jesse and Celine have together is a microcosm of life as a whole. Jesse and Celine have a literal sunrise that heralds the end of their one night together. And in a similar respect, we have our own sunrise waiting for us at the end of our lives. This is an interesting sort of way to imagine the idea of our lives ending. Normally, we'd associate our time going out with something like a sunset, an ending, but instead, it's paralleled with a sunrise, a new beginning. Our time on Earth is ultimately a temporary thing, and it's a matter that we're forced to reckon with. You may be like Jesse and have an ambivalence towards the end of your life, or you may be like Celine and be fretting over it constantly, or it's entirely possible, and likely, that you're somewhere in between. In the same way that we must take into account this frame for our lives, so too do Jesse and Celine have to deal with the consequences of their ephemeral time together. Most intriguingly is that there's a sort of transcendence from the extinguishment of both death and their time together. Love. As previously mentioned, when Jesse and Celine talk in the boat, they speculate on the difficulty of seeing each other once more. Given that they live an ocean away from each other, they'd have to go through great lengths to meet once again. Jesse specifically brings up the fact that Celine is scared of flying because of her fear of an accident happening, but she decides that it wouldn't be so bad to take a plane after all if it meant that she would get to see him again. At the end of the movie, despite resolving that their relationship would only last that night, they decide at the last minute that in fact they do want to try to make it work. It's decided that they'll meet back in this spot in Vienna once more 6 months from now, before bidding each other goodbye. In both the instance of Celine's decision to fly and their time together ending, it's love that transcends the confines of time. Celine's decision to fly is her love conquering her fear of death, and their decision to fight for their relationship is their love transcending the limited time they had for their one night together. Death is a difficult thing to consider, and every part of our lives is in some way confined to a limited period of time, whether it be the time we have at a specific school, or job, or time getting to be with someone before their own time ends. Both in life as a whole and within its smaller pockets, we all have to deal with the dilemma of everything inevitably coming to an end. Much in the way that Celine remarked that if no one knows you're dead, then it's as if you're still alive. It's our love for one another that allows us in so many ways to exist beyond our time. That bond that we have, whether romantic or platonic, is something that ripples through time and into the future. For those who are spiritual, it's this very love that carries us on to our next stage of existence. So, despite the fear that death may bring with it, understand that the greatest comfort we have is the transcendent nature of our relationships with one another. Through love, we last eternally, in its ever-flowing ripples throughout time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed me talking about something scary, like death, you might also enjoy me talking about beauty and life in the video on screen about Dead Poets Society.